What's a negative rake scraper? How can it help you as a wood turner when your project calls for the use of a scraper? My name is Mike Peace and welcome to my shop. I'm passionate about wood turning and I want to share with you tips, tricks, and techniques to help you with your wood turning. If this is something you're interested in, please click on the subscribe button. I want to give a shout out to Gary McCoy for suggesting this video. Thanks, Gary. Have you ever used a scraper and gotten a horrendous catch? Well, this is where a negative rake scraper comes in. That's just one of the many things we're going to talk about starting now. Okay, I'm working on a platter, and I'm coming across here. It's very hard Bradford pear, very dense grain, and I'm cutting into side grain, so it's kind of a tough going. So let's come across here. Take a very light cut. Trying to ride the bevel. Now, despite my best efforts, it doesn't look too bad, but I've got a few ripples here, and that's where scrapers tend to come in very well for doing cleanup work where you have some small tool marks. And as we've talked about in previous videos, you're going to take very light pressure. Now, with a conventional scraper, this is probably not a good example because it's a little on the small side, but I haven't converted it to a negative rake. To use it, you're going to have to lift the handle up higher and come across. If you don't, and you're going to cut, actually I need to adjust the tool rest up a little bit. You need to be cutting at or slightly below center. If you don't have the thing angled down like this, if you get a catch, it's going to be self-feeding, and you're going to get a horrendous catch if you don't generally operate in a negative rake. And you're going to come across and clean up those tool marks. Well, the advantage of a negative rake scraper with that secondary bevel, number one, you can come across flat and still not worry about self-feeding because of that secondary bevel. It's almost like it's going downhill. Some people think there's no difference between using a conventional scraper in this manner versus a negative scraper because they said the angle that touches is going to be the same. I can't explain why, but there is a difference. Number one, it's far less aggressive. Stuart Batty, who is an outstanding instructor and a really very knowledgeable wood turning technician, besides being an artist. He says that if you use a conventional scraper, you need to have a overhang ratio of the tool to where it touches the tool rest 7 to 1, 7 times this length compared to the distance between where the tool touches the wood and the tool rest, a 7 to 1 ratio, because there's so much leverage that you've got to deal with if you get a catch. He says that the negative rake scraper is far less aggressive, and you can get by with a much shorter handle. You only need a 5 to 1 ratio. So that gives you a pretty graphic example of the difference in aggressiveness. And these are primarily for cleanup cuts, but you want a tool that's not going to get you in trouble, and that's one of the serious advantages of a negative rake scraper is they're safer to use. They're easier to use. It's easier to hold it flat coming across like this. Another advantage is you can engage a very wide part of the tool cutting. Normally, when you're dealing with a scraper, you only want a small amount of the tool touching the wood. But with a negative rake scraper, you can have a much wider band of metal, if you will, touching the wood without getting you in trouble. And you'll find that most useful in a bowl. Let me grab a bowl blank and give you a better example. So in a bowl, you could have a French rake that's touching more of the wood, and it'll still be safe. We talked about in the earlier video 10 tips for bowl scrapers, that you don't want to come across a tool rest out here to the rim because that can get you in serious trouble. This will start flexing, and next thing you know, it's going to explode on you. If you're careful with a negative rake scraper, because it is less aggressive, you can come out a lot further out on the edge of either a platter or a bowl safely. And then, as we talked about in a recent video, if you're using a shearing cut, it makes it even less aggressive when you come out here to the edge. Some folks argue that the negative rake scraper will also give you a better finish than a conventional scraper. Some of that's a matter of how you put the burr on it, how you sharpen it, and your technique. Now that's the pros. It's user friendly, it's safer, fewer catches, it's easier to control, you can gauge a wide area safely, you can get a better finish, and it's less aggressive and you can get away with a shorter handle. Now on the cons, the burr is very fragile on a negative rake scraper, and you've got to refresh that burr about every 30 seconds to a minute or so for M2 steel, maybe a little bit longer weight on some of the tougher M42 or A10 powdered metal scrapers. So I was researching this video. I went on Doc Green's website. I'll show that on the screen. He's a retired physicist, wrote this book that I found very helpful, Fixtures and Chucking for Woodturning. Doesn't have anything to do about scrapers on this book, but he had some tremendously good articles about scrapers on his website, so I'll show that reference. Okay, so we know a negative rake scraper's got two bevels, but what size should that bevel be? Should it be like this with a fairly blunt? This is about 70 degrees and about 25 degrees on top with a somewhat longer bevel. Should it look more like this with just just a flat edge on it on the top, not very long at all? Or should it look more like this skew? Well, there's not an easy answer. As this chart shows, we get a wide variation from any number of noted turners with different opinions. So I think it goes back to that old joke: if you ask 10 wood turners, you're going to get 11 different answers. I think in my case, I'm going to experiment with it, and I would urge you to do the same. And I think by experimenting, I'm going to start with whatever I've got. Now in this case, this is a skew. I want to maintain it as a skew, so I don't want to go too far off from either the profile or the angle. Right now it's about 45 degrees. So I think I'll probably keep it at that, experiment. When I need a really cute angle, I'll probably pick up this and tune it up. If I find that I get more use out of it as a scraper than a skew, maybe I'll permanently change it to a French curve. As opposed to this Allen Lacer style skew. Now, on this very large, thick Sorby scraper, it started off with an angle typical of many conventional scrapers, somewhere between 70 and 80 degrees. I prefer more like 70, so I reground it, especially when I put a negative rake on the front. Now this top edge is, as I said, 25 degrees, so 70 plus 25 is 95 degrees. So I've got an included angle of slightly more than 90 degrees. There's a lot of steel to grind here, so I'll experiment with this a little bit as I maybe make the flat a little more acute, going from 25 maybe closer to 30, and maybe then as I go back to the grinder, I'll change that front angle from closer to 70 degrees to work it back to 60. But I'll do it in degrees as I experiment with it and as I use it, instead of just going whole hog and just grinding a lot of steel away. Now, this inexpensive Chinese steel Penn State scraper, the front of it is similar to the Sorby, it's 70 degrees, but I don't like this short bevel. It may be good enough to get the job done, but I'd prefer one a little bit longer, because as I sharpen the front, this is going to disappear, so I'm going to have to go back to the grinder and put it on anyway. So I want to make it a little bit longer. So let's do that. Let's go over to the grinder and let me show you how we're going to do that. And then let's talk a little bit more about burrs, because frankly I think maybe burrs are more important. How you put a burr on there may be more important than your particular angles. So as a practical matter in my experimentation, one of the factors that's going to assist me in choosing what that top angle is going to be the lowest setting on my particular robo rest, which I believe is somewhere close to 25 degrees, and that makes it convenient to reestablish that. So I'm going to start with that and see if that's good enough. So Let's give that a shot. We're just going to hold this up here and just slowly bring this around. And now I've got a little bit longer bevel, and I like that better. Now you notice I'm using my very fine wheel. You could be using aluminum oxide wheel, same principle, but I'm using my finer grit wheel 180 because, as we talked about in an earlier video, one of the most important aspects of the quality of the cut on a scraper is going to be just how fine a surface do you have here, how polished, and you're going to get much better more polished surface with a 180 grit than I would with a 80 grit. Next I'm going to do the front side again because I created a burr that's going in the wrong direction. So I've changed this back to 70 degrees. We're just going to lightly dress this. I need to take a little bit more off here, but I think I'll do that at a later time. Now that's raised a burr on the front, and let's give that a try and see what it looks like in use. Now because the burr on a negative rake scraper is very fragile, you need to slow your speed down a little bit. I'm not going to go much faster than about 650. So we will keep it flat. We're just going to go very, very light. And let's see what kind of shavings we get. Uneven surface, just a little smoother surface. You see the nice fluffy shavings. Also getting a certain amount of sawdust, very fine dust, which is not necessarily a good thing. I'm going to change the approach on how the burr touches the wood a little bit, see if it makes a difference. So I'm getting some very nice shavings, I think you can see. So I'm going to put those on the bed way. Now let's try something different with this burr. Now I'm an advocate of sharpening your tools the way they need to be sharpened, but keeping them sharp. But different people are going to disagree. The finest burr comes from burnishing, either with a carbide rod or a diamond or CBN hone, as I'm doing here. The first thing we've got to do is take off that burr just by lightly rubbing this with this hone. Now I'm going to come across this at a slight angle and just rub it. And I'm going to do that a couple of times, trying to maintain the same angle. And that reestablishes a burr. And it puts a very, very fine burr on there that's stronger than the burr that comes off the grinder, a little bit finer, so it should last a little longer, but it's a little more effort to make one. So let's see what happens. Again, I'm getting some very fine shavings, just a tiny little bit of dust. Now here's those two piles of shavings. The one on the top of the screen are the ones from the grinder burr. The ones on the bottom are from the burnished burr, and frankly I can't tell real big differences between them. I've got to continue working with that, but I'll keep working at it to see if I can get an improvement, or otherwise I'm going to go with the burr that's the easiest for me to make. So now we're going to try that same experiment using the my skew, or extreme negative rake scraper. I simply ground the bottom
at about a 23-degree angle, and that raised a burr, and it's a very significant burr. I can feel it. So let's see what happens with that. Well, the shavings are piling up as opposed to flying off. I'm not sure what that says, but they're very, very fine shavings. Now, because this is a fragile burr, any burr on a negative rake scraper won't last more than 30 minutes, or rather 30 seconds to a minute. You want to use the entire surface. So as I'm coming across, I don't want to stay in the same place. I want to maybe move the tool slightly so I can use different aspects of the edge to use the entire burr before I have to go back and refresh it. This looks to me to be getting finer shavings in appearance, but it's again, it's not easy to tell. Now, just remember, when you do go to the grinder for this type with the skew, you have to remember to sharpen the side that's going to be on the tool rest, because the burr is formed on the top of the tool, so you want to make sure the top of the tool is going to be the upside when you use it. In other words, I can't flip it over and do this without going back to the grinder, because the burr is going in the wrong direction. So, similar to the last experiment, we're going to take off the burr that we created with the grinding wheel. Just very light pass. Doesn't take much to get rid of that. And now we're going to, I'm going to use a little different approach. I had a class with Eric Lofstrom, and he showed how to make a burnishing tool from a carbide. Anyhow, how to make this burnishing tool out of a Dremel tool. So we're going to bring it up at a little less than 90 degrees, and we're just going to come along. And we're going to do that a couple of times, trying to maintain the same angle with steady pressure, not too heavy, and we'll see how that does. Wow. Wow. I would say these are wider shavings, but they seem to be very nice. They're a little bit larger, so I'm not sure that it's cutting better, but they sure seem nice and fluffy. Now, let's look at the surface of the wood, because that's what really counts, and I've just got a flawless surface here. I've got no tear out. It's just very smooth. I think I could start sanding that, I believe, with 220 without any problem at all. All right, let's try one more thing with just one of these scrapers. We're going to bring this up. It's a negative rake scraper, but we're going to bring it up on its side and bring it across and use it as a shear scraper, or shear scraping technique. And let's see if we get any difference. Because of the bevel of this thing, I'm going to pull this back just a little bit. Now these shavings are finer than what I had before, because they're not as thick. So again, it gave me a very smooth surface, but frankly, I had a very good surface before. Because this is flat and we're not running into end grain. Most of this is side grain. I don't know that it makes a whole lot of difference to come up as a shear scrape. I think I'm going to do just fine coming across. So maybe not the best experiment, but while we're at it, let's go ahead and try it with the other one. And I believe this burr needs to be redone because I was getting mostly sawdust. So, but one of the things I pointed out in an earlier video, I just want to stress again, negative rake you can still use it as a shear scrape. You want to make sure your tool it doesn't have sharp edges here along the bottom, so when you bring it up, it will glide across your tool rest. Now, if negative rake scrapers are so great, shouldn't I regrind all of them? Well, the jury's still out. Here's a few scrapers I know I'm going to keep in the present form. Number one, a box scraper. I want that to have a nice sharp corner so I can control it when I go down the wall of a box or shaping the inside wall up near the mouth. I'm not going to change that one. Here's one of the original scrapers I had, a little small for big bowls, this round scraper. I use it for a lot of small items, boxes, inside boxes, inside the lid, inside the bottom, on the bottom of bowls in small areas. I'm comfortable with it. I think I'll probably just leave that one. My spear point scraper, I'm not sure. I think I'm going to leave it for the time being, but if I ever get in a situation where I'm catching both sides, it's liable to send me back to make this a negative rake scraper, because as we've talked about, a negative rake scraper is less aggressive. This is a great tool for getting in corners, but you got to be real careful not to be cutting on both sides, and a negative rake might make that safer, but I'm going to hold off on sharpening this as a negative rake. Well, it's been a good series so far. I've learned a lot about scrapers and going through this process, because there's an old expression that says to teach is to learn twice, and I think I learned an awful lot from making these, and I learned an awful lot from y'all's comments. If you got any comments, please leave them below on your thoughts and experience on negative rake scrapers. But before we round up, let me just touch on summarize a couple of things. Again, very light pressure, no more than the pressure you put on your hands under a hair dryer. A negative rake scraper has got a very fragile burr, so you got to refresh it about every 30 seconds or a minute or so. You also want to slow your turning down. Don't go as fast as you normally would, because that'll keep that burr protected just a little bit longer. Use the entire edge of that burr. Use all of it. So move the tool across the entire edge so it'll last a little bit longer. And as we learned about negative rake scrapers, they're not as aggressive as a conventional scraper. They don't take off as much wood, but it's a finishing tool, just to get rid of tool marks and imperfections and refine the surface a little bit. So thanks for visiting with us. Stay safe. Y'all come back here.